for Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 302nd Artillery Regiment, the morning of June 6, 1944, began like no other in 4 years of war. He had commanded an artillery battery nestled in reinforced concrete casements overlooking the Normandy coast, a stretch of beach the Allies would soon immortalize with the code name Omaha. The air that early morning was cold and damp, filled with the familiar scent of salt spray and wet earth drifting across the English Channel. It was just after 5 a.m., another watch, another day of anxious waiting. But through his binoculars, as the first hints of dawn struggled to pierce the gray stillness, the sea began to transform before his eyes. What appeared first was barely distinguishable from the mist itself, a dark line where sea met sky. But it wasn't fading with the darkness. It was sharpening, multiplying, growing clearer with each passing minute. This wasn't a fleet. This was a floating city of steel, a massive metropolis of ships sailing out of the fog and into history. At that precise moment, before a single Allied soldier had set foot on the beaches below, before the world even knew the names Omaha or Utah or Gold, Richter understood with absolute clarity the Reich was drowning. Part 1. Fortress Europe and Strategic Illusions. To comprehend the shock of that morning, one must first understand the mindset of Fortress Europe in the spring of 1944. From the Norwegian coast down to the Spanish frontier, German engineers had constructed the Atlantic Wall, conceived as an impenetrable chain of concrete and steel, bristling with guns, a barrier designed to shatter any invasion attempt before it could gain a foothold. In the minds of German high command and in the propaganda disseminated to the soldiers manning the positions, the Atlantic Wall represented absolute proof of the Reich's power and strategic foresight. But Richter, now 32 years old, was not a believer in propaganda. He was a professional soldier and a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he had witnessed both the Wehrmacht's terrible victories and its gradual decline. He was pragmatic, observant, and deeply, profoundly tired. The Atlantic Wall itself was far from the impenetrable fortress that Berlin had promised. In reality, it was a patchwork of positions, many incomplete, others hastily constructed. Minefields had gaps. Bunkers were scattered across 2,400 miles of coastline, with the heaviest concentrations around key ports like Cherbourg and major installations. The vast distances between strong points meant that even a powerful position could be isolated and bypassed. The real problem, however, lay in the strategic calculus of the German High Command. Military intelligence was convinced, absolutely certain, that the main Allied invasion would come at the Pas de Calais. The shortest point across the Channel, it was the logical choice, militarily speaking. The Germans even possessed evidence, or so they believed. Under Operation Fortitude, the most elaborate deception campaign of the Second World War, the Allies had created something that didn't exist, the first U.S. Army Group, or Fusilier. Using inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, and fake radio transmissions, they had constructed the illusion of a massive invasion force assembling in southeastern England. General George S. Patton was publicly announced as commander of this phantom army a strategic masterstroke, for Patton was the general most feared and respected by German high command. Double agents working for British intelligence, most notably the Spanish spy Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, fed carefully crafted false information to Berlin. The Germans were so impressed with Garbo's intelligence network that they awarded him the Iron Cross, never suspecting that half of his agents existed only in his imagination. The deception worked perfectly. German General Hans Kramer, released from a prisoner of war camp and repatriated to Germany, was driven through the areas of genuine D-Day preparations. But British handlers, using changed road signs and carefully placed references, made him believe he was seeing massive forces gathering near Calais. When Kramer returned to Berlin and spoke with his old friend Field Marshal Rommel, he reported seeing enormous invasion preparations in the Pas-de-Calais region. The trap had snapped shut. The 15th Army, Germany's strongest force in France, was positioned around the Pas-de-Calais and ordered to remain on high alert. At the moment when Operation Overlord launched, those powerful units were frozen in place, waiting for an invasion that would never come. They were strategically paralyzed by a phantom army that existed only in their minds. Normandy was considered a secondary target, a possible diversionary attack, but certainly not the main event. This catastrophic miscalculation would prove fatal to German defensive efforts. Units like Richter's 352nd Infantry Division, stationed at Normandy, were considered adequate, but not elite. They were far below the standard of the veteran formations that had conquered France in 1940. Part 2. The 352nd Infantry Division Defenders of Omaha. The 352nd Infantry Division, under the command of Major General Dietrich Kreis, had been relocated to the Normandy sector in March 1944, a placement that would later be credited by some Allied accounts as a complete surprise, though intelligence records show that American commanders had received information about the relocation, though too late to alter invasion plans. The division itself was a mixed formation. It contained seasoned veterans like Richter, men who had survived the brutal crucible of the Eastern Front and understood the realities of modern warfare. But they were heavily outnumbered by younger conscripts, many barely 18 years old, and older reservists. They were brave and dutiful, but they were not the supermen of Wehrmacht mythology. They were defenders tasked with holding a line stretched far too thin across miles of hostile coastline. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with improving Atlantic wall defenses beginning in late 1943, had understood a fundamental truth that the High Command in Berlin seemed to ignore. If the Allies weren't defeated on the beaches in the first 24 hours, the war in the West would be lost. After the first day, Allied air superiority would render any German reinforcements moving toward the coast vulnerable to complete destruction. The first day was the only day that mattered. Rommel had been a whirlwind of activity. He ordered millions of mines to be placed in the coastal waters and on the beaches. He directed the installation of thousands of jagged steel obstacles devices the men called Rommel's asparagus, designed to tear the hulls of landing craft before they could reach the shore. He pushed for more concrete, more steel, more guns, more everything. Yet even these improvements could not hide a fundamental weakness. The Atlantic Wall was more psychological weapon than military reality. The physical obstacles were formidable, but the human defenders, while disciplined and professionally trained, were not sufficient in number. The division's 352nd Artillery Regiment consisted of skilled gunners with solid, well-maintained cannons, but their firepower, however impressive when directed at close range, would prove insignificant against the industrial might of the Allied invasion machine. Part 3. Dawn, the impossible fleet appears. On the night of June 5th, the tension had been a living, suffocating presence in every bunker, every trench, every dugout along the coast. German soldiers knew something was coming. Radar operators had been reporting unusual electromagnetic activity. Reconnaissance flights had returned with sketchy intelligence. But no one, not a single commander from battalion level to field marshal level, expected the invasion on June 6th. The weather was foul rain, wind, choppy seas. Military logic suggested the Allies would wait for better conditions. This assumption was Richter's salvation. The German Meteorological Office had predicted the bad weather would continue for at least 2 weeks. German commanders stood down. Supplies weren't being rushed forward with maximum urgency. Key officers, including Field Marshal Rommel himself, were away from their posts. Rommel was in Germany celebrating his wife's 50th birthday. Rommel, the Desert Fox, the commander most feared by the Allies, was not present when the invasion began. As dawn approached on June 6th, Richter stood in his observation post, a concrete bunker sunk into a high bluff overlooking the sea. He had been stationed at Normandy for months, watching, always watching, calculating, drilling his men on firing solutions, maintaining the guns, staring out at the gray, empty water. They had drilled these procedures thousands of times, but drills were always conducted with the assumption that they were preparing for something theoretical. At 5:10 a.m., visibility began to improve slightly. The first hints of false dawn were starting to gray the eastern sky. Richter raised his binoculars to his eyes. At first, he could make out nothing unusual, but then he saw it, a smudge on the horizon. He focused the lenses, adjusted them, and looked again. The smudge was growing. The optical magnification showed him details that made his breath catch. The horizon was packed with ships, not dozens, not hundreds. The number was incomprehensible. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, landing craft, transport vessels, all of them moving slowly, inexorably toward the coast. It was the sight of overwhelming industrial power made visible. It was an invasion fleet that represented the combined maritime production of the United States, Britain, and Canada. Part 4. The First Shots Artillery Duel and the USS Corey Richter didn't wait for confirmation from higher command. He shouted orders to his men. Aroused by the commotion and the urgency in their commander's voice, they stared out from their positions, their faces reflecting equal parts awe and terror. The drills were over. This was real. At approximately 5:30 a.m., German artillery batteries along the coast began opening fire. The first shots fired in the Normandy sector came from German gun crews, including those under Richter's command. The rangefinders called out numbers that seemed impossibly large. The giant barrels of the cannons, silent for so long, began to elevate slowly, their muzzles pointing toward the floating metropolis on the horizon. At 5:33 a.m., the USS Corey, a Gleaves-class destroyer serving as part of the fire support unit for Utah Beach, was hit below the waterline. The destroyer, under command of Commander George Dewey Hoffman, had been positioned to provide close-in bombardment support. An aircraft that was supposed to have laid down a protective smoke screen was shot down before it could deploy its cover, leaving the ship dangerously exposed. The Corey, unprotected and clearly visible against the growing light, became a target for German shore batteries, particularly those at Crisbeck and Asseville, which were positioned 8 kilometers inland. Shells struck the destroyer repeatedly. One round hit the 40-millimeter gun barrel and detonated the ammunition dump nearby. The rudder was damaged and became locked to the right. With her steering compromised and water rushing into the engine room, the Corey became uncontrollable. From Richter's perspective in his bunker, observing through his binoculars, the German guns had drawn first blood. A direct hit was registered on an American destroyer. There was a flash of orange and a puff of black smoke. A cheer went up from his men. For a few minutes, it felt like a real battle. It felt like their training and discipline mattered. It felt like they might actually be able to repel this invasion. But the feeling was desperately fleeting. The ship listed, crippled, and despite valiant efforts by her crew to steer her back to deeper water, the USS Corey sank at 6:40 a.m., becoming the only American destroyer sunk on D-Day. She settled in shallow water so that her hull remained partially above the surface, a stark monument to German defensive capability. Part 5. The naval bombardment and the illusion of power. For a few minutes, as his guns fired again and again, Richter felt a surge of professional pride. His men were good. They adjusted their aim with disciplined precision. They fired with the rhythm and efficiency of long training. But the pride turned to dread, then to something far worse, futility. For every ship they harassed, 100 sailed past untouched. The endless lines of vessels kept coming, an iron tide that couldn't be stopped. The Allies hadn't scattered. They hadn't slowed down. The gap in the formation was simply filled instantly. More ships appeared to take the place of any damaged vessel. Then Richter saw what he had been dreading. The Allied battleships' massive warships, like the USS Texas, turned their enormous 14-inch guns toward the shore. He saw flashes of light from the big ships on the horizon, like a silent lightning storm occurring far away. A few seconds later, the air around him began to tear itself apart. The ground began to heave. Geysers of earth erupted from the field surrounding his position. Shock waves from nearby impacts threw men to the ground. The systematic industrial-scale process of dismantling the Atlantic Wall had begun. This was not warfare as it had been conducted in the static trenches of the Eastern Front. This was something different. This was something mechanical, impersonal, and absolutely overwhelming. Richter looked past his own shell impacts and saw the larger picture. The scale of the bombardment was unlike anything in his experience. This wasn't a duel between artillery batteries. This was the concentrated firepower of a superpower directed with methodical precision at every German defensive position from Utah Beach in the west to Sword Beach in the east. Part 6. The question, where are the Panzers? The question that haunted every German defender that morning was the same. Where are the Panzers? German doctrine, refined through years of warfare in Europe and Russia, called for rapid armored counterattacks. When an invasion began, tanks would be rushed to the beachhead to overwhelm the landing troops before they could establish a secure foothold. The Panzers would drive the Allies back into the sea. But where were the tanks? The closest armored unit capable of mounting a serious counterattack was the 21st Panzer Division, stationed inland from Caen. This division, reformed around a cadre of veterans from the North African campaign, possessed some of Germany's best remaining tanks and was commanded by General Edgar Feuchtinger. On the morning of June the 6th at 1 a.m., the 21st Panzer Division had been alerted to possible invasion activity. But the orders directing its movement kept changing. General Marx, commanding the LXX Corps, wanted the Panzers to attack the airborne landings east of the Orne River. Then, at around 10 a.m., General Feuchtinger was ordered to split his forces, part to attack the seaborne landings, part to continue attacking the airborne troops. The fatal delay came from higher command in Berlin. Nazi policy, directed by Adolf Hitler himself, required that any major panzer movement be approved by the Führer's headquarters. Hitler was asleep when the invasion began. His staff was reluctant to wake him. By the time approval was finally granted for the 21st Panzer Division to move, precious hours had been lost. When the Panzers finally did move around midday, they were hampered by roads choked with German units moving in confusion, by refugees fleeing the invasion area, and by the complete absence of air cover. German pilots couldn't get airborne. The Luftwaffe had been shattered in recent months by Allied air superiority, and on June 6th, German pilots faced a sky literally black with Allied fighter bombers. Oberst Bronikowski, commanding the Panzer Regiment of the 21st Panzer Division, was forced to take a diversionary route through the industrial suburb of Colombelles. This wasted critical time. By the time his tanks reached the area near Caen where they were supposed to attack, American and British forces had already consolidated their positions. The promised Panzer counterattack, when it came, was too little, too late, and was executed without air cover, which made it suicidally vulnerable to Allied aircraft. Part 7. The Sky. A German nightmare. Richter scanned the skies above the beachhead and saw nothing but Allied planes, fighters, bombers, transport aircraft. The Luftwaffe had been promised air cover. Where were the German fighters? The answer was brutal and simple. They had been destroyed or were grounded. After months of attrition in earlier campaigns, the German Air Force in France was a shadow of its former self. The Allies, by contrast, had achieved complete air superiority, with over 11,000 aircraft committed to the invasion. They flew 14,000 sorties, on June 6th alone. The German MG-42 machine gunners, like Heinrich Sevelow stationed at strong point WN-62 near the eastern edge of Omaha Beach, could fire with terrifying accuracy at landing craft and troops struggling ashore. Sevelow, armed with the best light machine gun of World War II, the MG-42, with its incredible rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute, inflicted terrible casualties on the Americans. Some historians credit him with possibly 500 to 1,000 casualties, though his own post-war claim of over 2,000 remains hotly disputed by scholars who question whether such figures are physically possible. But the machine gunners, however deadly and however disciplined, were defending positions that were being subjected to systematic destruction from the air and from naval artillery that their own guns couldn't reach. It was a desperate, ultimately hopeless situation. Part 8. The Realization Industrial Might Eclipsing Tactics. In that moment, as his own guns continued firing and the sky rained steel and fire, Richter's perspective shifted fundamentally. The tactical part of his brain, the professional soldier's mind that thought in terms of fields of fire, firing solutions, and maneuver shutdown. It was replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. He was no longer seeing ships and soldiers and beach obstacles. He was seeing the manifestation of industrial production on an almost incomprehensible scale. The Allies weren't trying to outmaneuver him. They weren't attempting to outwit him with clever tactics. They were methodically attempting to erase him and everything he represented. By noon, the 352nd Artillery Regiment had expended most of its ammunition and inflicted negligible damage on the invasion force. Richter gave the order to cease fire and prepare for withdrawal. The shells continued to fall around his position. The ground continued to heave. Reports came in of other strong points being overwhelmed. The Normandy campaign would continue for 3 months. By August 21st, it had become a German catastrophe. Approximately 320,000 German casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured, had been inflicted during the 2.5-month struggle. Approximately 30,000 Germans had been killed, 80,000 wounded, and 210,000 captured or listed as missing. Over 2,300 tanks and armored vehicles had been destroyed or abandoned, virtually every tank in France. In contrast, Allied losses were roughly 209,000 total casualties, with approximately 37,000 killed. But the crucial difference was that Allied losses were being replaced daily. Replacement ships arrived with fresh troops, new equipment, and supply materials. By July, the Allies had landed over 2 million men in Normandy and could replace losses immediately. Epilogue. A brutal truth learned from Klaus Richter's perspective in his bunker on June 6, 1944, several profound truths became apparent truths that would be confirmed over the following weeks and months. First, the Atlantic Wall was not an impenetrable fortress. It was a string of positions that could be overwhelmed by sufficient force applied at the right place at the right time. Second, German tactical skill, demonstrated by men like Sevelow and other German defenders who fought with discipline and courage, could not compensate for overwhelming numerical and material superiority. Third, the strategic miscalculation regarding Pas-de-Calais had proven fatal. The 15th Army, Germany's strongest force in France, remained frozen in place, unable to respond to the actual invasion. By the time German High Command realized that Normandy was the true invasion site and not a diversion, the Allies had landed so many troops that reinforcements became nearly impossible to deploy effectively. Fourth, German operational doctrine, which relied on rapid concentration of force and decisive battlefield maneuver, had encountered an enemy that simply produced more of everything: more ships, more aircraft, more tanks, more ammunition, more soldiers, more supplies. The mathematics of industrial warfare had rendered German courage and tactical expertise nearly irrelevant. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered France in 1940 with a combination of speed, surprise, and brilliant maneuver, was now facing an opponent that had learned to convert wealth and production capacity into direct combat power. Klaus Richter and the men of the 352nd Infantry Division had fought with professionalism and discipline. They had inflicted real casualties on the Allies. They had held certain positions longer than might have been expected given the overwhelming odds. But they had learned history's hardest lesson. In the age of industrial warfare, nations that could not match their enemies' production capabilities were doomed to defeat regardless of the skill or sacrifice of their soldiers. On June 6, 1944, as Richter watched the endless wave of ships continuing to disgorge their cargo of men and materials onto the Normandy beaches, he was witnessing not just a military defeat, but the manifestation of a fundamental truth about 20th century warfare. The arsenal of democracy had proven superior to Nazi industrial production. The democratic nations, with their larger population bases and their capacity to mobilize economic resources on an unprecedented scale, could simply overwhelm totalitarian nations through sheer material abundance. The invasion Richter had promised to throw back into the sea swept instead over him and his comrades, carrying with it not just military defeat, but the promise of total defeat, a crushing demonstration that the Nazi vision of racial superiority and military dominance had collided with the reality of Allied industrial supremacy and shattered completely. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, World War II had entered its final phase. The unexpected visitors had crossed the water with impunity. They had cracked the wall of Fortress Europe at 5 places along the Normandy coast, and they had decided to stay.